Welcome to Kungfu Explained, and the second episode of the Hidden History of Shuai Jiao series. In the last episode, we looked at the currently disseminated narrative regarding Shuai Jiao's history, and we scrutinized the claims of both age and origin closely. We found that although the history is repeated extensively today, there is a lack of evidence to corroborate these claimed origins. Now, we will look into where this rhetoric originated and why, by firstly going back to the period from which much of this purported history stems, and that is the Republican era. Allow me to firstly mention some of the reference and research sources that I utilized for this series, which some of you may want to look at further. These include Marrow of the Nation, written by Andrew Morris, published by the University of California Press. The Manchu Way, by Mark C. Elliott, published by Stanford University Press. The Method of Chinese Wrestling by Tong Joongii, translated by Tim Cartmel and published by Blue Snake Books. The Origins of the Boxer Uprising by Joseph Escherwick, published by the University of California Press. And Forlorn Heritage, which is a thesis paper written by Alex Xian Zhao for the Leiden University. This excellent thesis is focused specifically on the subject of Shuai Jiao's history and was a major source for much that I present in this series. I would also like to thank Professor Ma Liang for generously providing me with theses that he has written related to the subjects I cover here. There are, of course, many other sources that I referenced as well, both in English and Chinese, which I mention as specific aspects are presented. In order to understand the roots of modern Shuai Jiao, we need to first look at the early Republican era in China. This was the period directly after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 and runs to 1949. It is crucial that one is familiar with the politics and history of the end of the Qing and the Republican era in order to fully understand what occurred and why Shuai Jiao's history has been presented as it has been up until today. The Qing dynasty was the last imperial dynasty to rule China. It was established in 1636 by Aising-Gyoro Nurhaci. He was a chieftain of a minor Jurchen or Nujin tribe, and he unified the various Jurchen tribes under the banner system, creating the Manchu people. The Manchu and Jurchen are Tungusic people, hailing from northeast China, from what is today's Jilin and Heilongjiang provinces. They are the descendants of the Jurchen people who established the Jin dynasty after toppling the Song dynasty. The Jin themselves were then conquered by the Mongols. In 1644, under Nurhaci's son, Hong Taiji, the relatively unknown tribe of Manchus conquered China, toppling the Ming dynasty and formally established the Qing dynasty. The Manchu were not Han people and were considered foreign barbarians by the Han majority. The majority of the Han Chinese resented being ruled by the Manchus, and this sentiment was worsened towards the end of the Qing dynasty. A series of famines, natural disasters, political failures, as well as military losses by the Qing to foreign powers further drove resentment towards the ruling Manchus. The Qing government lost both the First and Second Opium Wars to various European powers, which severely damaged the economy, which further affected the common people negatively, who saw this as a failure of their ruling Qing. During this time, a Han of the Hakka group named Hong Xiuquan revolted against the Manchus and started the bloodiest civil war in human history that became known as the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping, under Hong, labeled the Manchus as demons and actually sought to exterminate them in totality. His Taiping army massacred 40,000 Manchus in Nanjing and 10,000 in Zhengzhou. If you are interested in the Taiping Rebellion, I highly recommend the book God's Chinese Son, written by Jonathan D. Spence. Throughout this period of chaos and lawlessness, bandits ran amok, further terrorizing the local populace. Secret societies sprung up, such as the Tiandi Hui, or Heaven and Earth Society, running protection rackets while at the same time being dedicated to the overthrowing of the Qing government. Slogans such as Fan Qing Fu Ming, which means overthrow the Qing and restore the Ming, were commonplace, albeit already an old sentiment of the Han people dating from the founding of the Qing dynasty. These ideas even found themselves into various Chinese martial arts systems that we know today, including Hungar, Wing Chun, Choy Lai Foot, and others. It is interesting to note that this anti-Manchu sentiment largely shaped many of the creation myths of various Chinese martial arts systems, and most of these tales were formulated in the late Qing dynasty, contrary to popular belief. In many cases, the practice of such martial arts was in itself an act of rebellion against the Manchus and their rule. The arts themselves became a symbol of Han solidarity against the foreign rule of the Manchus. The palm and fist salute, so widely spread today, was a representation of two Chinese characters, namely Ri, or sun, and Yue, or moon, which when combined form the character Ming, as in the Ming dynasty. Keep in mind, however, that during the late Qing dynasty, there were also Manchu martial arts societies whose practice was indistinguishable from the Han martial arts, yet they were devoid of such rhetoric. This included Shuai Jiao. In 1894, war broke out with Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War, which once again the Qing lost, and they sued for peace. Japan had just gone through the Meiji Restoration, which modernized Japan, and the Han saw this as a failure by the Qing government to keep up. All these foreign countries defeating the Qing and encroaching on China's territory, along with the droughts, plagues, floods, and other natural disasters that occurred, further fueled the outrage of the general Chinese populace, and this culminated in the Boxer Rebellion, which ran from 1899 to 1901. Known as the Yihequan, or the righteous and harmonious fists, the Boxers were comprised of common folk, some of which practiced Chinese martial arts, yet most of whom were largely being misled through superstitious ideas of magical talismans and invulnerability rituals and spells, as well as spiritual possession achieved through various rituals involving swords and other classical weaponry. These Boxers attacked all things foreign, including Christian missionaries, foreign legation and settlements, etc. This resulted in the Eight-Nation Alliance banding together to suppress the Boxers, and then, of course, the further occupation, destruction, and looting of China by these foreign groups. I plan to do a series on the Boxer Rebellion in the future. In any case, all these failures by the Qing government resulted in total disdain for the Manchus by the people of China. The majority Han viewed the Manchus as incapable, incompetent, and corrupted beyond measure, and this eventually led to the Xinhai Revolution of 1911, which overthrew the Qing dynasty, ending their imperial reign, and the Republican era began. The disdain and hatred of the Manchus was further revealed in 1911, when an estimated 10,000 Manchus were massacred in Wuhan, and 20,000 were slaughtered in Xi'an. As Edward Rhodes states in his book, Manchus and Han, Ethnic Relations and Political Power in Late Qing and Early Republican Periods, the revolution was hardly bloodless. It was far from a very minor affair, in which, according to a recent study, no more than 1,000 to 2,000 died. The casualties among the banner people, Manchus, at Xi'an alone were several times that. A disproportionate number of the people killed and wounded during the revolution were Manchus, victims of the virulent racist rhetoric that had been a staple of the revolutionaries' ideology for over a decade. The blood-curdling rhetoric and racist talk had by no means disappeared. For example, in early November 1911, the Shanghai military government announced that, in carrying out its heavy responsibility of restoration, it could avenge the bitter hatred of the Han race only by wiping out the Manchus. Sun Yat-sen was still referring to the Manchus by the derogatory term Kaitif, as when he renamed the Republicans' Northern Expeditionary Troops the Army to Quell the Kaitifs. Indeed, several days later, at Hongwu's tomb, he again denigrated them as Eastern barbarians. Stirred by such inflammatory messages, some of the revolutionaries, not surprisingly, sought to carry out genocide. At the same time, many banner people, fearing that the Republicans were as anti-Manchu as they professed, were driven to suicide lest they fall into the hands of their bloodthirsty enemies. In the early Republican era, Manchus even went so far as to hide their ethnicity and pass themselves off as Han. Some changed their names in order to do so as well. They made great efforts to disassociate themselves from their ethnic and cultural identity as far as possible. As you can see and understand from this, from the late Qing and into the Republican period, the Han majority had great disdain and hatred for the Manchus, and all that was associated with them, including their customs, culture, and practices. This is extremely important to keep in mind as we further investigate Shuai Jiao and the narrative that emerged of its origin and history during this period. Another key aspect to understand is the emergence of the sporting movement in late imperial China and in the early Republican period. We find that the development of physical education in Europe following the French Revolution was a key aspect to the rise of nationalism and the building of the concept of a nation-state. Western physical education and culture was initially introduced to China in the late Qing dynasty through, amongst others, the YMCA movement. This then developed from there into a national physical education movement, largely based on a combination of the German and Swedish calisthenics and military drills, as well as the modern sport and Olympic ideas which had taken root in Europe. Indeed, from the late Qing onwards, the Chinese themselves saw the concepts of Western sports and calisthenics and physical prowess as one of the core reasons why European nations were able to dominate the world at that time. As is stated in Marrow of the Nation by Andrew Morris, since the end of the Qing dynasty, it had been widely accepted in China that modern physical culture was the truest indicator of national strength and health. Specifically, this quality was envied in the Western European, American, and Japanese powers, which seemed able to expand their empires at will. Modern-minded Chinese wanted what these powerful nations had, and thus were very amenable to the new sporting and exercise forms that seemed, from their first use, to inculcate the values and attitudes needed to create a nation that could work and struggle as a team for the cause of victory. Chinese TU, however, owes its greatest debt to modern Japanese physical culture. Recent work by Douglas Reynolds and Lydia Liu has allowed us to see how crucial the Japanese presence and experience was in translating modernity into forms and language acceptable and comprehensible to Chinese modernizers. As is true in so many other cultural, intellectual, and political realms, it is almost impossible to imagine a Chinese physical culture shorn of its early Japanese influence. The very terms of Chinese physical culture, TU, Tisao, calisthenics and gymnastics, Yundong, exercise, sports, were direct translations of Japanese terms Taiku, Taiso, Undo, developed in the Meiji era. Japan is also the site where many progressive Chinese got their first taste of the addictive modern discipline delivered by German and Swedish-style calisthenics and gymnastics. The Republican government had as its top priority at the time to build a strong, united nation-state. This meant that the various ethnic groups of China had to be molded into a single concept of a nation and people of a unified China. This is similar to what was done by the Mongols previously when uniting disparate tribes into the Mongol nation, and of course what was done by the Jurchens when forming the Manchu people under the banner system. In order for this to succeed, a single national identity needed to be created, and the concept of the Chinese would have to be firmly based on the Han Chinese and their history, as they were the majority and now in power. It would also mean that the prejudice towards anything Manchu would influence all the rhetoric around this concept of a ethno-nation state. With that, sport and physical education was an important tool used by the Republicans, and it was developed along efforts to turn a dynastic realm into a modern nation-state, according to the political ideas of the time. So what we find occurring to greater degrees throughout the Republican era is growing nationalism that found its way into all facets of life, particularly into the sporting realm. As the initial sporting culture and method was an import of the West, this became a hotly contested issue amongst the early Republicans. Debates raged as to the suitability of Western calisthenics and sports for the Chinese nation. This in itself is preposterous because, as you are aware, China was comprised, and is comprised, of many differing ethnic groups, each with vastly differing physical characteristics. But in the effort to create a unified nation-state, the concept of a singular Chinese race and history had to be compounded. Therefore, it was crucial that an ancient Chinese sporting culture be created, and that linear histories up until present day be compiled. The idea of guocui, or the essence of the nation, emerged and needed to be consolidated as something uniquely Chinese. Guocui needed to be promoted, as opposed to the so-called foreign arts and sports. Again, we find in Morris's book, Marrow of the Nation, it states, "Those looking for TU in China's past sought a new understanding of the achievements and the wonders of ancient China that could blend with modern appeals to progress and international kinship." Xu Yibing's 1909 essay, The History of Physical Culture, the first TU history piece written in China, presented sport as yet another innovation to be credited to the great Chinese race. These investigations thus incorporated pre-modern imperial forms of physical culture into a linear, progressive history leading to the modern physical culture of the Republican 1910s. In an effort to reinforce this concept, writers of the time even went so far as to connect completely unrelated practices from the past, such as Ju, which was an ancient Chinese activity utilizing a ball, to modern sports, such as football, in an ancestor-descendant relationship. Yet, as Morris and others have written on this subject, from a critical position, it is easy to see that the cosmological meanings of Ju, kickball games, were a world apart from the sporting values of modern soccer, and that the ritual meanings of Zhou dynasty dance were far out of step with modern scientifically designed calisthenic routines. However, these connections were exactly the ones in which many Chinese of the early republic believed, as they authored new linear histories that emphasized the relation of the new Chinese TU to the physical forms that preceded it. We find the same thing had occurred regarding the rhetoric of Shuai Jiao's history at that time, and its connection to ancient Chinese activities. However, with the rampant anti-Manchu rhetoric that existed, combined with a fervent nationalism, it became absolutely crucial to erase the Mongol-Manchu origins of the art and commit entirely to the notion that Shuai Jiao was Chinese. As is stated in Failure, Nationalism and Literature, the Making of Modern Chinese Identity, there existed utility of cultural and racial origins in bolstering an injured national identity. As mentioned earlier, if practicing arts such as Cholai foot and Hungar in itself was deemed as an act of rebellion against the Manchus, then one can easily understand that the practice of what would be considered a Manchu art, such as Shuai Jiao, would therefore be deemed as an act of support of the Manchus, and all that their fallen empire stood for. This was something that simply could not happen in the Republican period. In such an environment, wrestlers would have to avoid advertising their practice as coming from Manchu heritage, and rather they would have to find a way to present it as being Chinese, in line with a newly emboldened, ethnicized national identity. In 1919, the May 4th movement erupted, which featured nationwide protests. Marrow of the Nation explained that this was an epoch-making movement that began as an anti-Japanese, anti-government protest and quickly evolved in a totalizing condemnation of the old ways that cursed the young Chinese Republic. This further upsurge in nationalism condemned many aspects related to the Chinese martial arts, as they were considered feudal, backwards, and remnants of the imperial past. This further affected how the arts were to be presented to the new nation of China. The various early Republican advocates of the promotion of Chinese martial arts, and particularly Shuai Jiao, had to carefully construct a narrative and history that would be better accepted in this fervent anti-Manchu and aggressive nationalistic period. This is where we find the origins of the narrative of Shuai Jiao's origins and history that has been repeated and carried forward until today. Next, we will look at the key figures that were responsible for this. The term Shuai Jiao was never used in imperial periods and is strictly a modern term. The term Shuai Jiao was formalized in the 1900s Republican era by Ma Liang. Take note, the character Jiao he used here is not the same character as is utilized today, but rather is the same character as that for a horn, as in Jiao Di. Ma Liang is an important figure in the modern development of Shuai Jiao and Chinese martial arts in general. He is the reason that Shuai Jiao was recognized and continued into the Republican era and up until today. Ma Liang, who was known as Ma Zijin, was born in Baoding in Hebei province in 1875. He was of the Muslim Hui ethnic group. In his early years, he studied at the Beiyang Military Academy and then spent the remainder of his life as a military officer, eventually becoming a lieutenant general. He was heavily involved in warfare and politics throughout his career. Although he made numerous terrible decisions in his life, which led to him being branded as a traitor, his work within the standardization, reformation, and modernization of Chinese martial arts in general cannot be overlooked. I am also going to do an in-depth episode on his life and work in the future. Ma Liang was passionate about Chinese martial arts and made efforts to reform, modernize, and promote them widely. In 1901, when Ma Liang was an instructor in the Shanxi Military School, he used his own compiled martial arts textbooks to teach the soldiers. At that time, his system was referred to as Ma Shi Ti Cao, or Ma Clan Calisthenics, and it was praised. Later, he was stationed in Baoding at the Zhili Military School, where he continued to further refine his system and instruction within his field. In 1905, he was transferred to Beijing, and it is here that his system received the support of Duan Qirui, who was a warlord and military commander who went on to become the most powerful man in China from 1916 to 1920, acting as the Republic's premier numerous times. Ma Liang taught these soldiers what he labeled as Lu Jiao Shu, which can roughly be translated as fast wrestling. In this environment, Ma had the freedom to experiment and test things out with his new system. To this end, he invited Baoding's famous wrestlers, Ma Qingyun and Wang Weihan, to teach, both of them being students from the same lineage as Ma Liang, stemming from Ping Jingyi, who was a well-known wrestler and martial artist, and also of the Muslim Hui ethnic group. Ping Jingyi lived in Baoding in the late Qing dynasty and was a well-known wrestler from the famous Qingzhen Sijie, or Mosque Street. He was one of a long line of Muslim martial artists, and he himself combined wrestling, along with other arts he had learnt, namely Shaolin Quan, to create his own system of martial arts, which is known as Baoding Kuai Jiao, or Baoding Fast Wrestling. Here you can see the correlation to the original name Ma Liang used for his wrestling system, called Lu Jiao Shu, which also means fast wrestling. Ping Jingyi's system utilized the wrestling jacket and was proactive and aggressive, and features hallmarks of a combination of the Manchu-Mongol wrestling along with techniques from his Shaolin Quan he learned. Incidentally, this connects Ma Liang's art to the well-known Chang Dongsheng, who later took the Baoding art to Taiwan, which then spread to the West. Chang himself was also of the Muslim Hui ethnic group. In 1907, Ma Liang's Lu Jiao Shu system was approved as a required physical course for all soldiers in the academy. Due to his outstanding level of skill, Wang Weihan was appointed as the chief instructor, and he taught both officers and soldiers coming from various townships within the Beiyang administration. In 1908, Ma Liang arranged a wrestling demonstration in which Ma himself participated as well, and this was viewed by various Republican-era generals. The demonstration was successful, and following this, various towns successively invited Ma Liang there to teach. Following this, Ma Liang dispatched Ma Qingyun, Wang Chengde, Sha Jincai, and Meng Guochun to teach his system in various areas. In 1909, Ma Liang was transferred to Baoding, an area with many outstanding wrestlers. Ma Liang continued to develop and teach his system there, and he produced talented individuals who he then dispatched to teach in other areas of the country. Here, his system caught the eye of General Wu Luzhen, who was very impressed with Ma Liang. He asked him to compile official teaching materials for both martial arts and wrestling to be utilized within the military. Wu himself had studied in a military academy in Japan at the end of the Qing dynasty, and he had seen the Japanese implementation of their Japanese Judo system for military learning firsthand. As he had seen their implementation of jiu-jitsu for the soldiers, he naturally felt that Chinese wrestling, having similar aspects, would achieve similar results for soldiers in China. Interestingly, Wu Lujin himself named Ma Liang's trial wrestling teaching model Roushu Jiaofan, or Jiu-Jitsu teaching model. Here, as mentioned previously, we can see the influence of the modernization of both the military and sport that occurred in Japan during the Meiji Restoration that it had on the Republican-era China. In 1911, Ma Liang was transferred to Shandong, and it is there that he compiled his codified works into what he called Zhonghua Xin Wushu, or China New Wushu. These textbooks were divided into 4 main subjects, the first being on wrestling, which he reverted to his old name of Lu Jiao Shu. The second being fist and leg class, which was focused on striking. The third was staff class, and the fourth subject was straight sword class. In 1913, following the formal establishment of the Republic of China, with the support of the business community, Ma Liang started to disseminate his system into various schools, thus transitioning his system out of a purely military sphere and into the public, into the realm of general physical education. As his military career improved, he was further emboldened to use his position to further promote and disseminate his martial arts system. He recruited numerous martial artists into his technical team. The majority of this team was comprised of people who were skilled at wrestling, such as Wang Ziping. His system was promoted to be included in police academy training, national military training, as well as within schools as general physical education. With that, in 1917, he finalized the official textbooks for his China New Wushu system. These were entitled Shuai Jiao Ke, or Wrestling Course, and Quan Jiao Ke, or Striking Course. This was the first time the term Shuai Jiao was utilized for wrestling. In 1918, the House of Representatives approved the proposal for the promotion of Ma Liang's Zhonghua Xin Wushu, or China New Wushu, which was proposed by House member Wang Ne. In 1919, a resolution was passed by the Ministry of Education that all middle school students learn martial arts. During this time, the courses for staff and straight sword were finalized by Ma Liang. In 1928, the Kuomintang government was officially established in Nanjing, and in the same year, they created the Nanjing Guoshuguan, or the Nanjing Guoshu Institute. They continued to promote and disseminate the already implemented Zhonghua Xin Wushu curriculum of Ma Liang, and their future endeavors were based on this. Within the curriculum of their project, Shuai Jiao was officially included, and this was largely due to Ma Liang's preceding work and efforts. Although Ma Liang initially aimed his new wushu to be utilized within the realm of the military, it was taken by the Nanjing government and transformed into a sport, in line with the then prevalent drive for the revolutionizing of sport within China itself. This was done, much like many other countries of the time, particularly mirroring Japan, in an effort to build a nation-state and strengthen the populace, while at the same time, the nationalistic and Han-centric mentality that was pervasive at this time further drove this idea of promoting Bentu Tiyu, or sports from our own soil. Wrestling was a tool to strengthen the nationalist idea of a nation-state. Indeed, the promotion of the Republican government's idea of Bentu Tiyu, or sports from our own soil, which was a major idea at the time, would force people to create links between Shuai Jiao and the united Chinese country and its Han majority. Shuai Jiao was one of the 4 mandatory subjects of the Nanjing Guoshu Institute. The Guoshu movement, continuing on with Ma Liang's initial work, popularized and cemented Shuai Jiao to such an extent that it was widely practiced in China in the 1950s, and indeed up until today. Now let's examine some aspects related to Shuai Jiao and its origins, as was included by Ma Liang in his textbooks that were disseminated through his program, as well as by the Nanjing Guoshu movement that followed. Ma Liang deliberately attempts to rebrand Shuai Jiao and remove its Manchu and Mongol background, and we find this clearly in the foreword he wrote for these works. Incidentally, this is what was copied and pasted in similar ways by all writers that followed. And this was a direct result of the anti-Manchu Han nationalistic mentality that was pervasive at the time, as has already been demonstrated. Ma Liang immediately states that Shuai Jiao, or the Shuai Jiao Ke course that he compiled, was directly derived from Jueli, which was a term utilized previously for for wrestling, yet he doesn't make direct reference to the Qing-era wrestling or the Shanpu Ying of the Manchus, which is in fact where his own wrestling stemmed from. This was deliberate. In fact, he goes so far as to denigrate the wrestling of the Qing dynasty period, and the Manchus, by stating that by the time of the reign of Emperor Qianlong, it had degraded into a type of performance variety act. This is simply untrue, as the period of the Qing dynasty Shanpu Ying saw a period of great technical advancement and development of wrestling, as it had in effect become a professional vocation to be a Manchu bannerman wrestler. Again, his own wrestling descends from the Shanpu Ying, yet here he is denigrating it. He then contrasts this by saying that in the Han-led Song dynasty, the standard of wrestling was very high. He is hereby insinuating two things. One, that wrestling stems from the Song dynasty, and, by default, the Han people. And two, that the Qing version is a degraded version.
How dare you!
Ma Liang then goes on to even claim that wrestling was popular with famed Song dynasty general Yue Fei, and that the Shuai Jiao of today descends directly from him.
That is one big pile of shit.
Ma Liang did this deliberately, for nationalistic and Han-centric reasons. Yue Fei was a famed general who lived in the Song dynasty at the time when the Jurchens, who were the ancestors to the Manchus, were invading Han-controlled China. Yue Fei led numerous successful campaigns against the invading Jurchens before being martyred by a traitor to the Song. He was considered a Han national hero and achieved demigod status, and in the late Qing dynasty, when the anti-Manchu movement began, Yue Fei became a poster boy for the overthrowing of the Qing dynasty and represented total resistance against the Manchus. We see the linking of Yue Fei to the origin myths of various Chinese martial arts styles emerging in the late Qing dynasty. These include Xing Yi Quan, Eagle Claw, Fanzi Quan, Chuo Jiao, and others. Much like Ma Liang connecting Shuai Jiao to Yue Fei, other martial arts styles did this for nationalistic reasons and political reasons as well. By doing this, Ma Liang has managed to disconnect Shuai Jiao from its Manchu and Mongol origins, and presented it as a glorious Han activity stemming from the past, crediting it to a Han national hero in the form of Yue Fei, a person who died while fighting the ancestors of the Manchus. This was the only way Ma Liang could ensure that the art would not be outright rejected for its Manchu origins, but rather through his reinventing of its history based on Han ethnic and nationalistic principles, it would be celebrated and supported. This started with him and was continued and repeated in periods following, and is even espoused today, as was demonstrated in the previous episode. Ma Liang's efforts to promote the practice of Chinese martial arts received considerable opposition, predominantly from those within the May 4th movement, and even from the esteemed critical writer Lu Xun, all of whom saw it as a relic of the feudal and backwards past. The nationalist Kuomintang government got fully behind the promotion of Chinese martial arts on a national scale, and carried Ma Liang's model and curriculum forward. Included with that was the promotion of Shuai Jiao, as well as its newly created Han-centric history. Following the establishment of the Nanjing Guoshu Institute and its implementation of its national martial arts movement, we find a book on Shuai Jiao, which was published in 1935 and was highly influential on Chinese Shuai Jiao throughout China, as it was one of the only such books available and it was widely distributed. This book is still highly regarded today. The book was titled Zhongguo Shuai Jiao Fa, The Method of Chinese Wrestling, and was written by Tong Joongii. This book is available in English, translated by Tim Cartmel. Tong Joongii was born in 1878 in Tsang County of Hebei Province at the end of the Qing dynasty. He was a Manchurian of the plain white banner. He studied Liu Hequan under his father and was a well-known martial artist in Tsang County, along with people like Wang Ziping. While Tong Joongii was Manchu, he was not a member of the Shanpu Ying, and he learned his wrestling from a Mongolian named Cai Jintian, who was also a student of Liu Hequan. Tong Joongii, in fact, states in his description of the history of the art in his book that wrestling arts were most popular among the Manchurians and Mongolians. However, as this book was written by Tong far into the Republican era, well into the period when the arts and their promotion were heavily tainted by the nationalistic agenda of the government, we can see this creeping into many aspects contained within the book itself. For starters, the title adds the term Zhongguo, or China, to the term Shuai Jiao that Ma Liang coined. With this, Tong is clearly sending a message that his art is Chinese. In his own foreword in the book, he states the following: "These methods were used to strengthen the body, protect the country, and repel the barbarians, and so are considered to be peerless treasures." This statement is extremely telling, as he clearly states that Shuai Jiao was used to repel the barbarians. The irony is that he himself, being a Manchu, is what was considered a barbarian, along with the Mongolians. Again, this clearly places the art of Shuai Jiao in the hands of the Han Chinese, not the Manchus or the Mongols. Let's look closer at the various forewords included in the book. The first foreword in the book is penned by Chen Jiaxuan in 1931. In it, he states, "The art of Chinese wrestling flourished under the Qing dynasty. More than half of the soldiers of the Eight Banners practiced the art. The royal family enjoyed it in their leisure time, when the art was continually demonstrated for entertainment. It is said that the origins of the art lie within the wrestling style of the Mongolians, Guanjiao, and the Tibetan Buku." Here, he clearly states that the origins may lie with the Mongolians, but then incorrectly attributes the term Buku to the Tibetans. We will go into the etymology of this term in the next episode. However, further on he states, "From ancient Jiao Di to modern Chinese wrestling, there has been constant refinement and improvement." Here, he is repeating the now rebranded history of Chinese wrestling, which connects it to Jiao Di and the Han people's history. He does not explain the connection of his stated Mongolian roots to Jiao Di. The next foreword was penned by Jin Yiming in 1933. In it, he states, "In looking back at the history of Chinese wrestling, we see its origins in ancient times. It is said that Chiyo wore horns and gored his opponents. This gave the art its ancient name of Jiao Di, horn goring. During the Han and Qin periods, it became a spectator sport. Mongolians used wrestling as a test of strength. The Manchurians called the art Buku, while here Jin correctly states that the Manchus referred to it as Buku. He firstly states that the art originated with Jiao Di and the mythical figure of Chiyo, which we covered in the last episode. He then asserts a continuation from this origin to the Mongols, yet as usual, we see no mention of the connection represented. You can see from these two examples that the Jiao Di, Chiyo, and Han Chinese history of Shuai Jiao had been firmly established now in the late Republican era. Jin goes on to say, "Unfortunately, the spread of Chinese wrestling from the north to the south has not been great. This in itself is a telling comment, because if, as they state, Shuai Jiao was an integral part of Han culture and practice, why would it not be available in the south of China? And why does it primarily feature in the north? Again, this aspect is not elaborated on." The next foreword is by Tanghao, he himself being a prominent voice in the Republican era regarding wushu and Chinese martial arts. Penned in 1935, his foreword is the longest one in the book, and you will find all the references to Jiao Di, Xiangpu, Jueli, and historical records of various combat formats that we covered in episode 1 there. It may well be that the fleshing out of this aspect and the deliberate connection of these practices to modern Shuai Jiao and this rhetoric may well have largely been compiled by Tanghao himself. As he states, "The origins of the modern art go back to the ancient Jiao Di." In his foreword here, he doesn't only go so far as to connect modern Shuai Jiao to the ancient Han people, he even states that Japanese jiu-jitsu and judo come from China. He states, "Near the end of the Ming dynasty, the arts were taken to Japan and taught by Quan Yuanbin. The arts became known as jiu-jitsu in Japan. In the Wu Bei Zhi, the Bubishi, the arts are called shoubo, pugilism. Although the names are different, the arts are from the same source and fulfill a common need. Modern judo has its roots in ancient Chinese pugilistic and wrestling methods, which were originally taught together. In addition, Chinese pugilistic and wrestling arts also included locks and holds." We already saw in episode 1 that the historical records in Japan contrast this idea, and their records predate the suggested periods of transfer. But more importantly, from a logical point of view, the above claim is not credible.
You
sit on a throne of lies.
Tanghao goes on to state, the old name for judo is jujitsu. Kano changed the name to judo. Besides the technical aspects, judo also emphasizes training the martial spirit, bravery, and sacrifice. Kano had students who became famous military leaders during the Russo-Japanese War. These soldiers' willingness to die for their country was attributed to their judo training, and their exploits helped spread the fame of judo, bringing the art to the attention of the world. In the last 10 years, judo has spread far and wide. The Japanese invaders often used the stories of previous war heroes who gave their lives for their country as propaganda. All this helps fire the ambitions of the soldiers of invading armies. Our country is in the middle of an imperialistic invasion. When promoting martial art, we should not neglect its usefulness to our military troops, and we should use it to stir up our spirit of resistance. It is important to note that when this was written, the Japanese had already started their invasion of China, which preceded full-blown war in the Second Sino-Japanese War. There was already anger and resentment towards the Japanese, and this clearly explains the underlying reasons for Tang and others not only trying to paint Chinese Shuai Jiao as being the origin of the Japanese martial arts, but also that they are superior to the Japanese methods. At the same time, Tanghao doesn't mince his words when he explains that martial arts, with nationalistic propaganda infused, is an excellent tool to embolden a nation and unify it. And that is exactly what was occurring throughout the Republican period with regards to the course Shuai Jiao and martial arts in general took officially. In this episode, we have seen the underlying environment, mentality, and history that led to a fervent nationalistic mentality that affected how Shuai Jiao was rebranded and presented. The deliberate divorcing and covering up of the art's Manchu and Mongol origins were a result of the reality of the time, and this has simply been carried forward up until today. In the next episode, we will look into the history of the prominent wrestlers of this period themselves and their connection to the Shanpu of the Qing dynasty. We will look at the roots of the Manchu Shanpu itself. We will also investigate the archaeological, etymological, technical, cultural, and historical evidence to uncover the true roots of modern Shuai Jiao. That concludes this episode of Kungfu Explained and the second episode of the Hidden History of Shuai Jiao series. We will continue with our investigation in the next episode into the roots of modern Chinese Shuai Jiao. If you enjoyed this video, as well as my other endeavors, please do click like and subscribe. If you are able to, please support Mushin Martial Culture on Patreon. Until next time, keep training everyone.